Welcome to DarkLoreTube, where the darkest stories come to life. The third story.
The Soviet sleep test. In the closing years of the 1940s, somewhere deep inside a secret Soviet research facility, a disturbing experiment quietly began. A group of 5 prisoners, men labeled enemies of the state during the war, were placed inside a sealed chamber. The researchers were attempting something unprecedented, keeping human beings awake for 15 consecutive days using an experimental stimulant gas. The chamber was carefully controlled. Because the gas could become lethal in high concentrations, oxygen intake had to be monitored with precision. Technology at the time was limited. There were no closed-circuit cameras. Instead, the observers relied on microphones and small porthole windows made from thick glass, each pane nearly 5-inch thick. Inside, the prisoners were provided with basic necessities: cots without bedding, running water, a toilet, shelves of books, and enough dried food to sustain all 5 men for more than a month. The prisoners were told something that was not true. If they completed the test and remained awake for 30 days, they would be granted their freedom. For the first 5 days, everything appeared normal. The men read books, spoke quietly among themselves, and passed the time in conversation. Researchers monitored every word. Gradually, however, the subjects began discussing increasingly painful events from their pasts. After the 4th day, the tone of their conversations darkened noticeably. By the 5th day, something had begun to change. Complaints grew louder. The prisoners started questioning the circumstances that had brought them there. Suspicion spread among them like a slow fog. Paranoia took root. They stopped speaking directly to one another. Instead, they began whispering into the microphones, or toward the mirrored porthole windows. Strangely, each man seemed convinced he could gain the trust of the unseen researchers by quietly revealing things about the others imprisoned with him. At first, the researchers assumed this behavior might simply be a side effect of the gas. Then came the 9th day. Without warning, one of the prisoners, Sergei Antonov, began to scream. He ran from one end of the chamber to the other, shouting at the top of his lungs. The outburst continued for 3 hours straight. Eventually his voice weakened until only strained, broken sounds remained. The researchers suspected the intense screaming had damaged his vocal cords. But what disturbed them most was the reaction of the others. Or rather, the absence of one. The other prisoners barely responded. They continued whispering into the microphones as if nothing unusual were happening. Then another man began screaming. Meanwhile, the remaining 2 silent prisoners calmly began tearing pages from the books in the room. They covered the pages with filth and carefully pressed them against the glass windows, blocking the researchers' view into the chamber. The screaming stopped. The whispering stopped. And silence settled over the chamber. For 3 more days, the researchers heard nothing. Not a single sound. Every hour they checked the microphones, certain the equipment must have failed. Yet the oxygen consumption readings told a different story. All 5 subjects were still alive. More than alive. In fact, the oxygen levels suggested activity comparable to intense physical exertion. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers finally decided to break one of their own rules. They used the intercom. A voice echoed through the chamber. "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor. Failure to comply will result in lethal force. If you cooperate, one of you will be granted immediate freedom." For several seconds there was only silence. Then a calm voice answered, "We no longer want to be freed." The response shocked everyone in the control room. A heated debate followed between the scientists and the military officials overseeing the project. Eventually, a decision was reached. At midnight on the 15th day, the chamber would be opened. First, the stimulant gas was flushed out and replaced with fresh air. Immediately the microphones came alive again. Multiple voices began speaking, pleading desperately for the gas to be turned back on. When the chamber door finally opened, soldiers entered to retrieve the subjects. What they saw inside caused even the hardened operatives to recoil. only 4 of the 5 prisoners were still alive. The 5th had died days earlier. Food rations placed in the chamber after the 5th day had remained untouched. The condition of the surviving men was almost beyond comprehension. Large areas of tissue were missing from their bodies. Injuries covered their hands and fingers, suggesting they had inflicted many of the wounds themselves. Despite their condition, they were still alive. And astonishingly, their digestive systems appeared active. The soldiers refused to approach them. Many demanded the gas be turned back on. Others begged not to be removed from the chamber at all, insisting they must remain awake. When the soldiers attempted to extract them, the prisoners resisted with terrifying determination. The struggle became chaotic. Several soldiers were fatally injured during the attempt, and others were left severely wounded. In the aftermath, one of the surviving prisoners died almost immediately from internal injuries sustained during the struggle. The remaining 3 were restrained and transported to a medical facility. 2 of them, those whose voices remained intact, repeated the same request again and again. They wanted the gas. They wanted to stay awake. One of the subjects, Dmitry Volkov, was taken into surgery so doctors could attempt to return his organs to their proper place. But the medical team soon discovered something deeply disturbing. The sedatives had little effect on him, even after receiving a dosage far beyond what a human body should tolerate. He continued struggling violently against his restraints. Eventually, anesthesia was administered. The moment his eyes closed, his heart stopped. The next patient, Mikhail Petrov, had already lost his voice earlier in the experiment. When doctors prepared to administer anesthesia, he shook his head violently in refusal. Someone suggested performing the operation without it. He nodded. For the next 6 hours, surgeons worked while the patient remained conscious. The lead surgeon later insisted it should not have been medically possible for the man to remain alive during the procedure. One nurse assisting the operation would later recall something even stranger. Several times, when their eyes met, the patient seemed to smile. After the surgery, he was given a pen and paper to communicate. His message contained only 2 words: "Keep cutting." The remaining subjects underwent similar procedures, again without anesthesia. Throughout the operations they laughed continuously. Once the temporary paralytic drugs wore off, they again demanded the stimulant gas. When researchers finally asked them why they had done such things to themselves, why they insisted on returning to the gas, the answer was simple: "I must remain awake." The 3 survivors were eventually returned to the chamber while the scientists debated what to do next. Many researchers wanted the experiment terminated and the prisoners quietly euthanized. But the commanding officer, a former intelligence operative named Colonel Alexei Sidorov, had a different idea. He wanted to see what would happen if the subjects were exposed to the gas again. The order stood. As preparations were made, the prisoners were connected to EEG monitors so their brain activity could be studied. Strangely, the moment they realized they would be returned to the gas, they stopped resisting. One hummed constantly. Another strained against his restraints rhythmically. The third struggled desperately to keep his eyes open. Researchers monitoring the EEG noticed something strange. The brain activity appeared normal most of the time, but occasionally it flatlined completely, only to return seconds later. Then, suddenly, one subject's eyes closed. His brain activity shifted instantly into deep sleep. Moments later, the monitor flatlined permanently. His heart stopped at the same time. The last conscious prisoner began screaming to be sealed inside immediately. His EEG soon showed the same fatal pattern that appeared whenever sleep approached. Colonel Sidorov gave the order to seal the chamber with the remaining subjects, and 3 researchers, to observe the effects firsthand. At that moment, one of the researchers drew his pistol. He shot the colonel. Then he turned and ended the life of the silent prisoner lying nearby. Finally, he pointed the weapon at the last remaining subject, who was still restrained to a hospital bed. The other researchers fled the room. "I won't stay in here with these things," the man shouted. "What are you?" The prisoner smiled faintly. "Have you forgotten so easily?" he asked. "We are you. We are the madness hidden within every human mind, the part that waits in darkness. Longing to be free. We are what you silence every night when you fall asleep. The researcher stood frozen for a moment. Then he raised the pistol and fired directly into the subject's chest. The EEG monitor went flat. With his final breath, the subject whispered weakly, "So, nearly free?"